Well, good morning, Facebook and YouTube. We are live now, it looks like. So I'm just going to go and verify some things here just to make sure we are live. We are going to be talking about archaeology today for the UA Museum's Museum from Your Home live stream. So if you do have any questions for us, feel free to leave them in the comment section and we will do our best to answer them. So it does look like we are live. So I guess we should go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm the Communication Specialist for UA Museums. And joining me for a discussion about Gulf Coast archaeology is Dr. Mark Donop, the Office of Archaeological Research's Deputy Director and Curator of Archaeological Collections. Good morning, Mark. Thanks for being here today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very excited to hear about your archaeology background and what you have to tell us about Gulf Coast archaeology, because I don't know much about it, so I'm excited to learn. Well, while we are broadcasting here on Facebook and the UA Museum's YouTube channel, you can watch it over at YouTube as well. Feel free to ask us any questions in the comments. If you have any questions or comments that you would like us to see, you can definitely do that. And as a reminder, this is all live, so anything can happen. So just hang in there with us in case Facebook has any issues, YouTube has any issues, or even we have any issues. So just remember that this is all live. So now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, Mark, I was curious if we could start talking about how you got into archaeology.
Well, it's sort of a long story, but I'll shorten it. I went in the Air Force and did medical field, and I got out and I was continuing in that direction, working at a hospital and going to school. And I had to fill a few electives in, so I took a cultural anthro. I loved it, took the physical anthro class, and unfortunately there were no other classes to take in anthropology at the time where I was at. And but I loved them so much that I ended up steering 90 degrees and headed to the University of Florida, where I eventually got my PhD in 2017 in archaeology. So.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, it's cool to see how sometimes your path might take a different turn, an unexpected turn. But that's really cool that you found something you really liked in archaeology.
Yeah, I do love it, and that's why I've stuck with it, and it's paid off, and now I'm here talking to you about it. So
that's awesome. Well, I'm glad that we could talk about it today. Aside from that, you wanted to talk about Gulf Coast archaeology today. So what did you want to tell us about that specifically?
Well, I'm not going to give you an overview of all the Gulf Coast archaeology, would be impossible in an hour anyway. But I'm going to talk about two areas or case studies to talk about more sort of underlying issues that have to do more with why the Gulf Coast was significant to Native Americans in particular. And my specialty is more pre-Columbian, but also into contact period. So more of the underlying reasons why the Gulf Coast was sort of important archaeologically and to the people of the past. So the two dots that we have there are two stars. One of them is in Florida, obviously, in the Gulf Coast. That's where I did my dissertation research. And that's just north of Cedar Key. It's a place called Shell Mound, which is an accessible park where you can actually walk on top of the site. There's a walking trail with some signage. And that area is where I did my dissertation research and finished up in 2017. That was with Dr. Kenneth Sassaman and Dr. Neil Wallace at the University of Florida, who I owe a lot to, and I have to acknowledge right away. So the other star is a place that I just visited in February, which is the Bottle Creek site, which is a magnificent site. Went up there to help put a sign in for with Matt Gage of the OAR, the director, and it reminded me so much of the Gulf Coast of Florida. And then it was just so impressive with the mounds and everything is there, the landscape. So I've decided to incorporate that into my talk today. So. And this map here is obviously the Gulf Coast. I've included sort of the entire Gulf Coast, but we're only going to really be talking about Florida into Alabama and really concentrating on those two sites. So I can talk about some other issues that I think are important when talking about Gulf Coast archaeology. You can flip the slide. All right. First place I'm going to talk about was that the star that was on the Gulf Coast, Shell Mound, which is sort of a simplification because there's a lot of sites associated with the Shell Mound. But the important part to start with is why it's there. And Dr. Sassaman has really weeded out some really interesting reasons why the site was even initiated in that area, and also a lot of other sites around the in that tract. Foremost is there's these relic paleo dunes that were laid down naturally thousands of years ago, and they're all along the coast, sort of sporadically along this area. And we believe that this is what attracted early peoples to these particular locations in why not other places? Because there's a lot of resources along the coast, but why did they start placing sites, particularly burial mounds, at the distal ends of these parabolic relic paleo dunes?
So, Mark, I have a quick question. So I know kind of what a dune is, but what makes something a paleo dune?
It would be the paleo part of it being the dates be Paleolithic.
Oh, okay.
Or older. So we're talking about, it's not a dune that formed in the last 100 years or even 1,000 years. It's thousands of years in the past. So when the climate was drier, and Florida, it actually wasn't part of the coast would be much further west. The prevailing winds would blow these loose, dry sands into these forms, into these parabolic forms. And we call it relic because over the thousands of years, they've been worn down and shifted around a bit, but they still hold some of their shape, maybe just part of the arm or what, but they still hold some of their shape. And we believe that attracted indigenous peoples to them for a variety of reasons. And one of them, or the primary reason, is that they are naturally aligned to the solstices, summer solstice, and the reciprocal being the winter solstice. So we accept that the Native Americans in the past had a very complex cosmologies and understandings of the world, of the universe, and that by seeing what was in the sky, they recognized that this was a materialization on the ground. And because they could see sort of this materialized solstice, they gave it special meaning and emplaced sites there, and primarily burial mounds and cemeteries, but then later on others like civic ceremonial centers and other monumental constructions. Palmetto Mound is a place that I did a lot of work at, as far as a lot of museum work, really. As a mortuary mound, very long lived, about 2,000 years. So about 800 BC, it was established, as well as far as we can tell. Maybe took a while to become a mound, but we believe that it has a very long lifespan and was very important to the area, a real sort of magnet. But it was put on the end of that southern distal end of the relic paleo dune of that area for a reason, and it likely was to be some, maybe the belief was that it was a nexus. It was a portal, a place that during the solstice, summer, perhaps also winter, it became a place where the dead or the living could sort of pass through worlds. A lot of the thoughts that we have are based in ethnohistory and in Native American beliefs as a way to inform archaeology. And we found it to be very productive because there's only really so far archaeology can take you. And then the rest of it is really getting into the meaning behind things. So we can describe a lot of things, but often it's difficult to explain why something like a burial mound that was just densely filled with objects and human remains, why it existed. So we've gone sort of in that direction, and I think it's been really fruitful. So the burial mound there was emplaced about 800 BC, but before that, in the late Archaic, thousands of years earlier, they also emplaced the dead in cemeteries in at least 3 locations in our target research area. So there's a precedent for them emplacing the deceased and objects in those specific locations at the distal end of these relic parabolic paleo dunes. So that pattern was really interesting. I think it's a precedent for later peoples that they continued in that pattern. Now, Shell Mound itself, 8LV42, that was terraformed on a part of the arm of southern arm of one of these dunes, paleo dunes, directly east from Palmetto Mound. We don't think that was an accident either. It was both following the arm, but it also, I believe it was meaningfully put there as sort of a east-west axis, where in the West, traditionally in indigenous beliefs, West is toward the land of the dead or the realm of the dead. So it makes some sense that the living, who I'll be talking about, held feasting events and such in the Shell Mound, and then the dead ended up on an island most of the time, directly to the west. A lot of these sites, this area, it wasn't considered really a civic ceremonial center for a long time and recently. And I think in large part it is because this is it's coastal and it's made up of sites that are what we maybe would consider divided by water. But instead, I believe the indigenous people didn't see that as a division. Water was more of a conduit for them. They traveled across it. They lived off of it. They consumed, food from it. So I don't think it's an impediment. It was more it was expedient for them. It facilitated movement and all kinds of things that we'll talk about a little later too. So this civic ceremonial center is actually more sort of dispersed among islands and such. So it wasn't really recognized as a really coherent sort of civic ceremonial center for quite a while. That and it lacked a platform mound, or at least a clear one. And platform mounds are sort of on the trait list for civic ceremonial centers, but I don't necessarily think that that's necessary. So you can continue to the next slide. So I've used the term terraforming, and Dr. Sassam is a big proponent of the term, and I think it's accurate. This shows sort of stages at 8200 when Shell Mound was really begun to be constructed. So you can see the relic arm is in the gray area, and the pinkish sort of areas was where they were starting to build up shell, primarily shell, eastern oyster. And in fact, the final form by 8600 here, which is an arcuate, shell ring or shell construction, is it may have contained 1.2 billion oyster shells. Also contained other other shells, but oyster is the primary building material, terraforming. It is up to 7 meters tall at its apex, and it had a central plaza that was very well defined by 8600. A lot of these changes in the monumentality or the shape of Shell Mound may have coincided with some of the sea level changes that were happening also, which is obviously really important. And we believe also its relationship with Palmetto Mound. Another burial mound was constructed or terraformed to the northeast of Shell Mound at about 8500. And we believe there were shifting relationships, and those shifting relationships between the living and the dead and a lot of other things, some of it was probably predicated on sea level change also. So the water and the sea was really important to these people, and they changed their activities, their beliefs accordingly. So I've shown we have one of the units there. They get some of them get exceptionally deep, and inside the plaza area were many pits, and the pits have been very informative as to the activities that were happening there, which really seems like feasting events. There appears to be a student of Dr. Sassam, Jessica Jenkins, has done work on mariculture, and she has talked about them sort of cultivating oysters throughout this time period. And obviously, they were incorporated into this construction after they were consumed, but in some cases, maybe they were just used as a constructing material. There's also a difference between what was deposited in the mound and left valve versus right valve, and I believe it's the left valves that were ended up more in the mound. So there's a pattern to that too. That's not just discarding an oyster shell over your shoulder when you're done eating it. There's purpose to it all.
Yeah.
So, and that's really part of this. This is not a shell construction that is by accident. It may be very early in its history. It might have started off as a midden, but or strictly as a midden, but it became much more through time. So it's a highly prepared and thought out structure. We believe that through the evidence that we found, the pits in the plazas and everything else we've done in the area, that the feasting events, the solstitial events, so during summer solstice, that these may be world renewal ceremonies, sort of akin to the green corn ceremonies that were happening or are happening in the Southeast among Native Americans. So this was more of a renewal activity, and I'll talk later about how shell and water has a role in that. One of the key points of evidence was Josh Goodwin. He found evidence that juvenile white ibises were found in some of the pits, and by timing when they are seasonally in the area, it fits with the sort of June summer solstice. So one line of evidence amongst several that leads to the timing of the events there.
I wish we knew how they gathered 1.2 billion oyster shells. That must have taken quite a while.
Yeah,
that's a lot of oyster shells.
Yeah, it is, and not all of them, are there. So, like I said, some of the valves, the entire animal doesn't end up in the construction. But yeah, impressive, and very impressive in the shaping of it, and really the meanings behind it is what's most impressive about these things. It's also very impressive that it survived, because I'd say most shell constructions in Florida and other places have been mined out due to commercial interest. So this one actually almost entirely survived commercial mining and damage. So it's been a great source of information. So let's see what the next slide is. So I guess one thing I should also mention is that by 8650 to 700, the Shell Mountain Civic Ceremonial Center was abandoned. The area wasn't totally abandoned. There was some dispersal of population, but it seems like that abandonment event it happened widespread throughout the Southeast. Very sort of archaeologically, it was a very sudden event, and we're not exactly sure. In fact, we're not sure what precipitated that. So, on to exchange. These three objects in the upper left, greenstones sell a large galena object and a copper sheet. They're all from Palmetto Mound, right there adjacent to Shell Mound and part of the Civic Ceremonial Center. These are representative of some of the materials and objects that came from the northern interior. So they were exchanged and brought in for various reasons. I have a list there of some of the common materials that are exchanged in the Southeast and elsewhere, especially in pre-Columbian times. So the materials on the Gulf Coast, though, in exchange, what did they exchange? And it's really marine shell, and I probably should have put shark teeth in maybe parentheses, because I think it's a very minor component relative to marine shell. A tremendous amount of marine shell actually was exchanged and traveled outside of the Gulf Coast. And parts of Florida are really rich in the large gastropods, which I have pictured there. And that one actually was a shell cup with a hole in the bottom, which may be purposeful, the hole. But that would have been for perhaps drinking the black drink of the known throughout the Southeast. But marine shell was the big product that seems to be processed and sent elsewhere. and likely in exchange for these other materials and other objects. This also doesn't include the perishables, and later we'll talk about salt. Salt could be a perishable that it's hard to find archaeologically, but that's another one that could also be exchanged, and in ethnohistoric accounts was mentioned. All right, continue. Now, just to the northwest of Shell Mound, in the same Civic Ceremonial Center, there's Raleigh Island, and another student of Dr. Sassaman, Terry Barber, has done a lot of great work there. And recently, in cooperation with Dr. Eben Broadbent, Eben did the LiDAR here. He has some fantastic LiDAR that gets you amazing resolution. And he worked with Terry and Ken and other folks in the Laboratory of Southeastern Archaeology and got these images. And the first time that we really realized how complex Raleigh Island is and the sites on it. Dates generally to 8900 to 1200, so sort of late woodland, early Mississippian. Not that those periods are, fixed in stone, but that would be the general time period. And it's really notable for, its shell constructions. These are shell ridges. They're sort of clover leaves and other complex sort of shapes. And shell bead production at the site is pretty clear. And Terry's working on that right now, pretty close to being, I think, graduated. All right, next slide. So this is some of the evidence that he's come up with, and I've helped do some work on the site too, so I have some familiarity with it. You've got microliths and drills, and then evidence of shell bead reduction. So he's got the whole sequence there, which it can be rare to find this. In fact, it is rare, especially in the region, because we know that this has been happening. And then places like Cahokia and big Mississippian centers, they have thousands and thousands of marine shell objects, but it's been difficult to really trace them chemically. And it's more sort of just acknowledging that the Gulf Coast has a lot of the material. So you sort of assume that much of it is from that area. But he has direct evidence of the shell bead production and in some actual finished shell beads. And but a lot of evidence of just large scale production that's like being exchanged northward. All right. So why marine shell? Why is it so important in the past? I mean, why was it exchanged for things that were really valuable or really rare in sort of the Gulf Coast, like galena or copper? One of the biggest of the two big sources of copper is the Great Lakes, which is obviously really far away, and the Appalachians. So these things were valuable in part because they're so rare in certain areas. So if you hadn't seen a shiny piece of copper before, I think you would have been highly impressed, and probably a whole lot of other meanings behind it. Copper, galena, a lot of these objects, greenstone, quartz, crystal, they all have meanings or had meanings and have meanings to Native Americans. And it goes much further than just rarity. So a common shell to be exported or to be processed in the final products exported is that lightning welt that's shown there in the picture. And Terry has a few arrows there as to where they're heading, and it's big civic ceremonial centers during the Mississippian period, and they consumed a lot of them. I mean, there was burials that had thousands of them and with one individual. So they made them into gorgets, carved them. Shell cups also could be engraved. The shell cups could be used and were used for the black drink ceremony, which was a really important purification ceremony that was really widespread throughout the Southeast. So there was a lot of uses, or they were used in a lot of ways. But why is it so important? Is it just rarity? Is it some sort of, are they money? We got to be careful not to transpose our belief systems onto interpreting the past. It's hard to do because it's natural to us, but I don't think we can look at these things as just say money. It's not just shell money. So next slide. So part of it is to try to understand the cosmology of Native Americans. We can do that through ethno-historical documents, Native Americans today, and archaeology. So part of the core belief of a lot of Native Americans, a very pervasive belief, is that the cosmos is divided into three parts, three worlds, and that that's all in balance, but that balance has to be maintained. So you have the upper world, which is generally the sky. There's a lot of other things associated with the upper world, but I'm concentrating on the underworld today. Our world, or the middle world, and that's Earth, which likely in many beliefs started as an island. And then there's the underworld, and I'm concentrating in the underworld because I'm talking about the Gulf Coast and sort of watery landscapes today. So the underworld is associated with water. It's also creation. The Earth Diver origin story is pretty commonplace throughout the Southeast. And basically, it's the world started as water, and that certain animals were able to pass through the water to the bottom and get the mud off the bottom and bring it up and make an island. And the island became Earth. It became where humans could live. So it's an important narrative that I think is worth. It's so pervasive that it's one of those narratives that I think we can apply to archaeology and at least say, is this plausible? Does this fit scenarios? And I think it does in a lot of cases. So it's just a way of sort of informing the archaeology. It's also the underworld also has to do with renewal and change and death, and that also is death, like human death. So that souls have to pass through the underworld on their way to, the upper world, which is often through the Milky Way. It's a lot of really complex beliefs, and a lot of them are really so widespread that I think that we need to take them seriously when we talk about the past and archaeology. So through these worlds, there are portals and boundaries, and places that have that are put in sort of like Palmetto Mound and Shell Mound. They're put in places where these portals may open at certain times of the year or certain events, and we believe maybe the solstices is one of those times. So if you were to place your deceased there, or some representative part of them, or perhaps even objects, that their souls would be able to move through the other worlds and end up in the afterworld, and hopefully the upper world. And the Milky Way being one of the paths. So they also watch the Milky Way as being a path of souls. Also, to get into animacy is sort of something that is alien to many so-called Westerners, especially non-human animacy, or what we consider inanimate. But that's not true of what a lot of Native Americans believed, is that objects and places could be animate and could affect change. And that could be a pot, it could be a place like a shell midden, it could be the Paleo Dune, it could be a cave, it could be a body of water. So it's a complex belief system that, once again, I think we need to incorporate in archaeology. One of the things they talk about, liminal creatures, and Dr. Knight, emeritus at University of Alabama, he has talked at length about this subject, and it still holds a lot of water, is that liminal creatures may be able to transcend these boundaries, these world boundaries. And one of the beings that is depicted quite often are water birds. So I have right there is a Weeden Island pot, and that is it could be a roseate spoonbill, it could be a duck, or it might not be any of those. It might just have the features of those creatures. Maybe just the pot itself is imbued with certain abilities based on those features. I really honestly believe that with the skill level you see in, say, Weeden Island ceramics, if they wanted to depict anything, they could depict it very clearly and very accurately. So I believe that maybe they were just trying to capture sort of features of these animals. But water birds are probably the most common thing that is depicted in Weeden Island pottery. This pot here is from Palmetto Mound, from that area. So their ability to pass through boundaries was visible. Being water birds, they waded in the water. They could fly, and then they could walk on land. And also, a lot of them, like say the roseate spoonbill, has like a pink and white, coloration. That also, the colors are often meaningful in Native American cosmologies. So, how does this all apply to marine shell? So, marine shell. Next slide. Marine shell has a lot of symbolism behind it when you look into these accounts. So, like I said, it's associated with the underworld, water, the primordial sea, the beginning of everything, creation, renewal, change. Water's fluid, it's transformative. Also death, but also fertility, well-being, medicine, and its spiral form is also likely to have been important, because often the path of the soul or the structure of the world or cosmologies, it has to do with a spiral. And the lightning whelk has a left spiral, and that's unusual when compared to other big gastropods, and that probably made it more meaningful, and it became one of the targeted species to actually be made into objects that were exchanged over a large part of the United States. So I believe that the marine shell has a lot of symbolism, indigenous symbolism behind it, and that's part of the reason why it was exchanged like in such a wide area, is that it had much more importance than it being just attractive or something like that, or being some sort of money. But all right, next. So the Gulf Coast. Now I'll be heading toward Alabama, which I'm a lot less familiar with, but I'm giving myself a crash course. I got here in November to start as deputy director, so I'm still sort of absorbing Alabama's archaeology. But I was able to go to Bottle Creek in early February to help put some signage in. And yeah, it was very impressive, and I'm happy to include it here. Also, Dr. Ian Brown, who is just about to retire, was helpful in giving me some PowerPoints and also answering some of my questions about the site. So let's go to the next one. So Bottle Creek is considered central to the Pensacola culture. It's largely defined by ceramics, but this is sort of the area right here. It's centered on Mobile Bay, and Bottle Creek is the type site for the Pensacola culture. Over the years, the definitions have changed and its association with Fort Walton, but it looks like it's pretty clearly a Mississippian period ceramic tradition. And Bottle Creek is really sort of its epicenter. Like I said, it's largely defined by shell-tempered pottery. Next slide. So the spread of shell-tempered pottery, it seems to have come early from Moundville. So what is that, 1100 AD? There's a lot of Moundville, a good amount of Moundville influences in the pottery at Bottle Creek, early in its sort of days as a civic ceremonial center. So it seems as if Moundville had some connection to that area. Now there is earlier ceramics have been found there, like from Weeden Island, which I just mentioned from Palmetto Mound, but the primary occupation doesn't really pick up to about 80, 1250, and then goes to about 1,500, although it continues on for quite a ways. And in fact, there's a French account that that the mound was still active, and I'll mention that maybe in the next slide or two. So it's sort of a melting pot in that area, the Mobile Bay area. You're getting influences from the lower Mississippi Valley, traveling along the coast, and then you've got your panhandle influences from Florida. So a lot's going on there, and it's got a lot of resources, a lot of aquatic marine resources there. So it obviously it became a really important place when I start to talk about some of the features of Bottle Creek. Also mentioning the Gulf Coast, or talking about the Gulf Coast again, it's important to note that travel would have largely been by canoe when you're talking about transporting people and things. The water travel would have been your easiest way to go. And it's facilitated. There's a lot of sheltered areas along the Gulf Coast, so east-west travel would have been relatively easy, barring having any problems with, say, different groups along the way. But that would have facilitated exchange. And then also there's quite a few river drainages, generally go north-south, and those also facilitated trade from the Gulf up north and through those drainages. And those other materials we were talking about, like greenstone and mica and galena, they would have traveled likely through those water courses. So Mobile Bay is a good example. Several rivers end up emptying out into the bay, and are very navigable. So materials from the north would have ended up coming, down there, and then the Gulf products, like say the marine shell, would end up going north. And then, like I said, other probably perishables that we don't see. I spent some time in the Amazon, also in Brazil and in Guyana, and I came to realize there that what we see archaeologically is only probably a pretty small percentage of what their material culture actually was. Because I spent a lot of time with people that seemed to could weave anything. A basket, almost like they weaved a house. Mats, everything else that we generally don't find. For example, we basically infer, or we have indirect evidence of mats and things like that from some of the salt pans that have been found at Bottle Creek and other places. But I actually got to watch people making things and using them, and I really realized that perishables are a huge part of this, and we'll talk a little bit about salt production here in a second. All right, next slide. So Bottle Creek, I jammed a lot into this slide. So the natural area, talking about watery landscapes, much like when I was talking about Shell Mound, is that this is also an unusual landscape for us to think about the reasons behind putting in a big civic ceremonial center. There was at least 18 mounds built here, and it seems to be a sort of a natural levee in the swamp. Now, most of us as, modern folks would think, why is there, a big town, here in the middle of what we would consider nowhere? But there's a lot of resources in the area, number one. I mean, we think of swamps sometimes as not being places you want to live, but they're actually usually very productive. So there's a lot of resources, like dietary resources, a lot of things to eat there. A lot of waterways, so traveling is good. But we still kind of, puzzle at it and say, why was this thing built here? A lot of times in archaeology, we can figure out the how. We can get in there and figure out the how. But a lot of times the why is the most elusive part of it. And this is one of those places that's fascinating, I think, in part because of that reason. I don't think that it's been really figured out as to the why here. But there are definitely some ideas, and I know Dr. Brown has talked about it being a sacred place, and I get that impression. The the nuances of it, I'm not quite sure yet, but I think it might have to do with it also being a watery place that is possibly has symbolism involved with it, associations with the underworld. But it is at least 18 mounds, and then I wouldn't doubt maybe there's some low mounds out there that haven't been discovered yet, given the difficult conditions that are out there. Takes a boat ride and a half a mile walk through a trail that often is flooded and crisscrossed by little creeks. So it's not the easiest place to get to. But I really felt like I was back in Gulf Coast, Florida when I went out there in February. I actually loved it. It has a central plaza. Mound A, it's the tallest mound there. It's 14 meters tall, which is like 46 feet, give or take. So it's impressive, from its size. But what I find most impressive is the layout, is that you can just tell there's a lot of complexity going on. And I won't pretend to understand near enough right now, but like I said, a very impressive site. One you can actually visit. There are seasonal tours through the Blakely State Park. Given our COVID-19 situation, I'm not sure when that'll open up again, but that's worth looking into if you have a strong interest and you're able to hike a little ways into the site. Otherwise, don't go out there, and the site's protected. Do not go out there and just walk around yourself. That's illegal. So if you arrange a tour, would be good, but that's about all you can do. And then we get archaeologists to get in there and learn more about it so we can disseminate the information. Its primary occupation of Bottle Creek is, like I said, 1250 to 1550, but there are some earlier deposits there, and so there's an earlier history to it, at least into the late woodland. And then the site also persisted into post-contact times. So a Frenchman named Bienville, I'm sure I didn't say that right.
No, that should be right. Bien is French for good. So if somebody asks you how you're doing, you might say bien, which means I'm doing good.
All right. Well, good. He visited the site in 1702. He was brought by a native guide, and apparently he was maybe the earliest collector at the site, because he was looking for, he was told there were figurines on top of one of the mounds. So he went up there and collected these figurines and brought them back, and I'm not sure what happened to them eventually, but he actually came and took those. So those were, he was told those were offerings. So the site was actually still active into the 1700s, at least as sort of a sacred site. There apparently wasn't a population there, but at least had sacred importance to people in the area. The people that the French and the Spanish met and interacted with there, they ended up, those groups don't exist today, at least as coherent groups. They did mix in with Choctaw and other folks, so they did survive, but as discrete entities, it doesn't appear like that they made it. But they did mix in, like I said, with other groups, and succeeded that way. The site is a National Historic Landmark, which was made in 1995, and like I said, it's protected. Don't go out there and putter around. Try to get one of these tours whenever it's available. There's some questions as to whether there's my first thing was, are there any similarities with the Shell Mound area? So is there shell bead production? Well, there's a sizable microlith industry from Mound L, which was written about in 2003, but apparently almost or very little evidence of actually working marine shell. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist, and I'm not exactly sure how the preservation is there. That may be one factor, but the other is that sometimes they process these beads, and they don't keep any. They exchange them all. So it could be something like that. So it's interesting. The microliths do exist there, in some concentration. And it makes me think that, possibly it could be for some sort of marine shell production or processing. Another really interesting thing, there's salt pans have been found there, amongst other areas. I looked at salt production myself in the Caribbean. I did my master's in Caribbean archaeology, and I explored sort of a salt production, because you find ethnohistoric accounts of it, but because it's a perishable and a consumable, archaeologically you don't really find the salt. So you find the vessels, the ceramic vessels, and other things that were used to process them, but you have to be able to recognize that that's what they are. So it's difficult to really determine that it's salt production. But there are salt pans there, and they have fabric impressions on the bottom, big wide vessels, probably for evaporative reasons, or when you boil up the salt or the water, the saline, that it'll evaporate and you'll get the salt product. There are saline sites north of Bottle Creek. So headed toward Mountainville, there are several sites, so there are saline sites that are clearly used for salt production, at least by Mississippian times. So that's also an exchangeable that's very plausible, as far as one that's sort of near coastal that was controlled by local people and sent elsewhere for other objects. This may be one of the reasons that that Moundville was interested in this location, is that they moved down and established themselves here, or sort of bolstered maybe a local population, because they wanted maybe greater control over those salt sources. And Weinstein and Dumas talked about this, I think in 2008 and onward. But I find the salt production is fascinating. I think that's a plausible reason for at least one of the reasons for having sort of a hold on this area. So yeah, I think that Bottle Creek has a lot of potential, further potential for work there, and I would love to be involved in that in the future. So, and got to thank Dr. Brown for doing so much work there and really illuminating it. Acknowledgements. I ran out of time as far as who I needed to really acknowledge, but I have a long list and I have a little bit of time. So I'll start at Florida, Laboratory of Southeastern Archaeology with Dr. Sassman as the director. Everybody there, the graduate students, is a great group of people to work with. I've mentioned Terry Barber doing Raleigh Island and bead production. Jessica Jenkins is doing oyster mariculture and other things from the late woodland period. Anthony Boucher is currently doing St. John's research, but has done plenty of research in the Shell Mound area, especially talking about sort of cosmology and the importance of water. And several other people that have done good work in the area. Also, Dr. Neil Wallace at the Florida Museum of Natural History was my co-chair. He's been great. I worked with the collections intensively. And everybody there has been great. And then here at University of Alabama, like I said, I've only been here 5 months or so, but Matt Gage has been great, director of OAR. And I've also interacted with people at the anthropology department and the UA museums, and really just getting going now, but I see amazing potential for things that can be done here. And I just want to thank everybody for facilitating, research and everything else. So my acclamation to Northern Alabama. So
yeah,
I am originally from Western New York. So this Southeast is still a little bit alien to me, though the barbecue eases the pains. So.
Yeah, we do have a lot of that down here in Alabama. So we're very fortunate to have you from Florida. So we do, within our last maybe around 11 minutes, we have some questions. So let's see if we can get to some of those. So Eugene says he's been doing genealogical history on his ancestors and reading up on the history of the indigenous Anasazi. Is that how I is that pronounced correctly? People of the let's see, I guess the indigenous people, including the people of the United States. So, do you know anything about that, Mark? Any of those people?
I do not. Anasazi, I thought they were Southwestern folks, but I actually don't, and I don't want to pretend like I do. But we could look into it and get back to Eugene.
Yep, we definitely can. But that's cool that you're doing a genealogical history. We've been doing that in my family, and that's a really cool project to do, just to figure out where you came from. So best of luck to you in that pursuit. So we do have a question about if tools were made out of the shells. Do you know, with some of the shells that we talked about, I guess with the oyster shells, would tools be made out of those?
Yeah, there's definitely plenty of shell tools. Not so much the oysters, but there's crown conch hammers. There's actually pretty plentiful in the shell mound area. So the shells are often about that big, and they punch holes in them to get the animal out so you can consume the animal. But sometimes you find those holes, but then there may be 2 holes or even 3, and it looks as if they hafted those and they made themselves a shell hammer. And the shell hammer, it's sort of speculative as far as what their use were, and it could have been multiple uses, but it really looks as if the shell hammers, those particular shell hammers, were used to actually just punch more holes in the same types of shell to get the animals out. So they were really kind of small for sort of woodworking, but that seems to be probably the primary use for those. So that's one example. But yeah, there's a lot of other there's shell plummets for net weights. There's other ornaments, or what we would call ornaments. But yeah, there are quite a few tools that you can make with shell, and they would have, yeah.
That's pretty crafty.
Yeah. Well, in lieu of having a lot of, say, lithic sources too. There is lithics in, say, Gulf Coast, Florida, mostly chert, but there aren't large varieties like you might find elsewhere in the Southeast. But there are a lot of shell tools, and that's one example, is that shell hammer. So.
We did have a comment about the bird vessel that we showed in the slide. Is it in the UA collection? I can pull that back up if we want to reference that. Let's see. I'm assuming it's referencing this vessel right here. Do you know, it looks like it's the Florida Museum? Is that the Florida Museum of Natural History?
Florida Museum of Natural History. Yeah, I believe it's actually still on display in the museum right now. So in Powell Hall. So I did a little oral sort of presentation for that. So when you go through the museum, they have it set up so you have your smartphone. It'll when you get near it, I think it'll hit it and it'll give you a description of certain objects that are in the museum. So it's a really good public outreach. But that vessel is from Palmetto Mound, the site I talked about, and it's at the University of Florida.
Very cool. So do you do anything with Dauphin Island with all of this?
I personally haven't. I did work, as sort of maybe a side note, I did work on the post Gulf oil spill, about almost 10 years ago. So I've been through that area, and I was monitoring cleanup crews, but I haven't done any research there. But I know that there's some fascinating archaeology there, but I don't want to, like I said, pretend that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to Dauphin Island. But I've definitely gone through the area and know some of at least that coast. But there's a lot of shell midden sites in the Mobile Bay area. There's a lot of oyster, and then as you get further up into the brackish water, it's the Rangia clams. But there's some tremendous shell midden sites all throughout the bay. Some of them, or a lot of them, have been impacted by modern, expansion, but a lot of them still exist today, and they're extremely informative.
And there's a question, can you explain tempering and comment on the importance of the development of shell tempering for improving pottery artistically?
Actually, I'm not sure about the artistic part of it with the shell tempering, but I do know that all tempers affect the clays. So you have some natural inclusions which can affect clay. You could have mica and things like that in it. But intentional temper, like say a Native American puts something actually into the clay for certain reasons. The shell tempering has some like techno-functional characteristics. But also, I think a lot of it comes down to identity issues also. It's that you're making something that's visibly different than your neighbors, and it identifies you as a different group of people. And shell tempering is pretty obvious when you see it in the body of the clay, even after the vessel's been fired. So I think that's part of it. I would actually have to learn a little bit more about it. One reason is because where I was doing my dissertation, they didn't shell temper. It's like one of the few shell tempering agents that they didn't use. They used a wide variety of them, but it seems that they it's almost as if they avoided shell tempering.
That's very interesting. Well, I think we're running kind of low on time. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I wanted to give you the last word, Mark. If there are any things that you want to leave the audience with about this study of Gulf Coast archaeology, is there anything that you would want to impart to them before we leave today?
Well, I'd like to tell people that any of the sites that are accessible, like I said, Bottle Creek has sort of limited access, but that is something you could look into and visit the sites and go there responsibly with guides and really understand something about the site. There's a lot of sites all over the place in the Gulf Coast. Shell Mound is accessible. I know that's pretty far from Alabama, but that's a park also. And Dr. Sassman and others have really worked hard to sort of increase the public outreach by helping design and put the signs in and work on the place to really make it so where the public can really learn. And that's really probably our main goal, is to really inform the public. It's not just to learn things so a small group of archaeologists can talk about it in a conference room. It's to reach out to the public and really allow them to experience it also. Another thing that I would really stress is that when I talk about Native Americans in the past, it's not that the Native Americans are gone. There's many groups of Native Americans still around, and we have to keep that in mind. So I'd encourage you to participate in any, say, powwows or things that are open to the public, and really understand indigenous ways of life. And like I said, I really I find it important and really interesting to incorporate Native American life ways to inform archaeology. So I think it's extremely important. And like I said, many people are still here. And I mentioned that some of the groups that were encountered by the French or the Spanish don't exist as like coherent groups anymore, but they still in some part exist with the groups, say, like the Choctaw and the Seminoles.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Donop. Very interesting and very definitely something that I have learned from, and I would like to learn more about, because I'm sort of familiar with the Gulf Coast down there in the South of Alabama. So I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. Well, that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. We'll be doing this every weekday, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. And each day will feature a different aspect of UA Museums. Tomorrow, we're actually going to go over to the Alabama Museum of Natural History's Facebook page, and as well as the UA Museum's YouTube channel as well. And we're going to be talking about Harrell Station, which is the University of Alabama's paleontological site. So if you're interested in fossils, I'm sure we'll be talking about fossils there. I also want to make sure that everybody is aware that we are going to have a trivia night tomorrow night, Thursday night at 8 p.m. And we're going to be playing Jeopardy. So if you like Jeopardy, that should be a really fun event that we'll be doing. We'll be streaming from the UA Museum's Facebook page, the YouTube channel, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, the Moundville Archaeological Park, and the Discovering Alabama's Facebook pages. So you can find it basically anywhere. So make sure you like those Facebook pages and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss out on what we're doing. But that should be a really fun event. I know a lot of people are missing trivia nights that they used to go to on Thursday nights. And so since we can't go out for trivia night, we thought we would have our own trivia night. So that should be a lot of fun. And also, just in case you need some educational content at home, we have some of that located at museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. I'm going to pull, while we're here, I'll put that link up on the screen so everybody can see it. And what we have there is a full live stream schedule of everything we're doing. We also have a link to our UA Museums Color Art Collections coloring book. If you have anybody who likes to color, it's very cool. We also have Discovering Alabama's online educational resources, and we also have links to the Teacher's Corner over at the Alabama Museum of Natural History's website. So we have all of that there. Also want to remind you, if you're enjoying what we do here with these live streams and you want to be a supporting member of UA Museums, you can do that as well. You can go to give.ua.edu/museums. Well, thank you to everybody who stopped by today, and thank you for visiting UA Museums from your home. Hope everybody has a great day.